The fate of the war in Ukraine now hangs on a revised 20-point peace plan backed by the United States that demands dramatic, immediate trade-offs for a ceasefire. Okay, let's unpack this. We've got sources detailing the absolute latest critical diplomatic framework to end the war. It was unveiled by President Zelensky on December 24, 2025.
And this is important. This is not the original plan.
Not at all. This isn't that first 28-point draft that was, let's be honest, basically a Russian surrender document for Kiev.
Right. This is a new 20-point framework developed very closely with the U.S.
And it lays out some really painful concessions from Ukraine. So our mission today in this deep dive is to really distill the key differences. We're going to look at Russia's initial hardline demands versus this new U.S.-Ukraine position.
Focusing on, I assume, the big three.
Exactly. The territory Ukraine has to functionally cede, the massive, and I mean massive, $800 billion reconstruction price tag, and the security guarantees that. Well, they hinge almost entirely on Washington.
And it's all happening so fast. Diplomacy is racing ahead of that rumored U.S.-Russia summit.
Forcing Kiev's hand. So how did we even get to this current plan? What was the starting point?
Well, the starting point was, frankly, a non-starter. The initial 28-point draft was widely described as just overly favorable to Russia.
It's putting it mildly.
It demanded not just functional control, but legal recognition of Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk as Russian.
And this is crucial. It tried to cap Ukraine's military at only 600,000 personnel.
Just completely cripple their future defense.
Exactly.
And that plan was countered pretty quickly, right?
Oh, immediately. The European counterproposals came in, and they really helped shift the conversation. They pushed back hard on ceding any more territory de jure on paper.
And they wanted a bigger military.
A much more realistic one, a cap of 800,000 troops. But the real breakthrough is this new U.S.-Ukraine 20-point plan. It's a hard-fought middle ground.
So it gets rid of some of the worst Russian demands. It does. Things like forcing Kyiv to formally recognize annexed land. But, and this is a big but, it absolutely forces Ukraine to accept the military reality on the ground as it stands right now.
Okay, so if Ukraine is making these painful concessions, what is Moscow giving up in return?
Yeah.
What are the core demands being placed on them?
They're critical. First, Russia has to affirm Ukraine's sovereignty, which, is a massive ideological shift from their historical rhetoric.
That Ukraine is just a historical mistake.
Precisely. But maybe the most legally significant demand is that Russia has to commit to an unconditional non-aggression agreement against Europe and Ukraine.
And this isn't just a verbal promise.
No, not at all. The plan requires formal, legally binding ratification of that policy right inside the Russian State Duma.
So it has teeth. That seems to be the main accountability measure. But, the second you talk sovereignty, you run straight into the issue of territory. Mm-hmm. And this is where the political risk for President Zelensky is just off the charts.
It is the most difficult point. It's all in this one provision on territorial distribution. The key is how they define control in those four contested regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson.
So what's the language?
The plan says the line of military positions on the day the deal is signed becomes the de facto line of contact.
De facto, not de jure.
Exactly.
That legal hair splitting, the difference between reality on the ground and what's on paper, that's the whole ballgame here, isn't it?
It is. It's the only way to get a ceasefire without, a total political collapse in Kyiv. The source material uses a great analogy.
Let's hear it.
Ukraine is the homeowner. They absolutely refuse to sign the deed to grant permanent legal ownership to the squatter, which is Russia.
Okay.
But in exchange for an immediate end to the fighting, the homeowner accepts the squatter staying in the rooms they currently occupy. Ukraine refuses legal recognition, but accepts the front line as a functional temporary border.
That is a profound and, tragic trade-off. But the sources say there's still a fight over specific pieces of land, right? What's the sticking point in Donetsk?
Yeah, the lines aren't static. Russia is still demanding that Ukraine withdraw from the 20% of Donetsk Oblast it still controls.
How much is that?
We're talking about roughly 2,500 square miles. For Kyiv, that's just completely unacceptable. It's handing over land that Russia hasn't even won.
So if Russia won't budge, what's the U.S. proposal to break that deadlock?
Well, the U.S. has countered with this idea of a free economic zone in Donbas.
Trying to solve it with money instead of withdrawal.
Basically, yeah. But even that is politically explosive. President Zelensky has been very clear that any specific concession on territory, even an economic one, would require a nationwide referendum.
A referendum on ceding functional control of territory. That sounds like political suicide for a leader who built his entire platform on restoring the 1991 borders.
It would be. But you have to look at the pressure from the population. It's immense. The data is really telling here.
What does it say?
Back in December 2024, surveys showed that 38% of Ukrainians were open to territorial concessions if it meant a faster peace deal.
38%.
That's the highest figure since the war began. It tells you the abstract principle of total victory is eroding under the daily grind of war. People are desperate.
That's a sobering number. It reminds you that survival often trumps principles.
Yeah.
So territory is only ceded if you get security in return. Let's pivot to that. Where does this leave Ukraine and NATO?
The plan makes a key symbolic gesture. It rejects any kind of constitutional ban on NATO membership, so that long-term goal is still alive.
But in the short term?
In the immediate reality, it's a pivot to robust, personalized protection. Article 5, like security guarantees from the U.S., from NATO, from Europe.
Article 5, that's the key phrase. It sounds like neutral defense, but it's not the real thing. What are the conditions?
The conditionality is everything. The guarantees are explicitly voided if Ukraine invades Russia without provocation.
So it's a defensive pact only.
Right. It's meant to reassure Moscow. But on the flip side, the guarantees take effect immediately if Russia opens fire on Ukraine. The U.S. wants to hold the trigger. They're guaranteeing Ukraine's defense, but they are not writing a blank check for Kyiv to restart the fight.
But doesn't that just bake in a kind of perpetual dependency? Ukraine can't make a move without losing its shield.
That is absolutely the trade-off. Sovereignty for stability. And part of that stability is also about military size, that cap we mentioned.
Right, the 800,000 troops.
It's a massive rejection of Russia's original 600,000 demand. And to put that 800,000 number in perspective, it's nearly as large as Ukraine's current wartime force. It guarantees a robust, Western-funded defense going forward.
And guaranteeing a defense for 800,000 soldiers, that is a monumental financial commitment. Let's talk about the economics of this piece. Point 9 lays out this staggering scope.
The numbers are they're enormous. The total target for recovery, reconstruction, everything, it's $800 billion.
$800 billion. And the estimated damage was what, around $523 billion?
Exactly.
So why the extra nearly $300 billion?
It's aimed at total modernization. We're talking tech, AI infrastructure, natural resources, basically leapfrogging the country into the 21st century. The goal is a powerful, resilient Ukraine, not just a rebuilt ruin.
Okay, but the funding mechanism for this. This exposes a really assertive American power play. The specific clause was removed from the final plan, but we have to look at the original U.S. negotiating stance, Provision 14.
This is one of the most critical insights from the sources. The U.S. proposed taking definitive control of the estimated $300 billion in frozen Russian sovereign assets.
Not just seizing them, but directing them.
Precisely. Out of that $300 billion, $100 billion was earmarked for U.S.-led reconstruction efforts in Ukraine. And here's the kicker.
Go on.
The sources specified that the U.S. would receive 50% of the profits from that venture.
50%. So the U.S. wasn't just leading the effort, it was securing a massive return on investment from captured Russian funds.
Absolutely. And it went even further. Europe would be pressured to add another $100 billion, and the rest of the frozen assets. They would go into a separate U.S.-Russian investment vehicle,
giving the U.S. a controlling stake in Russia's future capital.
It was a stark attempt by the U.S. to dictate the financial terms of the entire post-war order in Ukraine and potentially influencing Russia's recovery, too.
So you have financial control layered on top of military stability. What about the ultimate enforcement? Who holds the hammer to make sure this all works?
Well, the enforcement structure puts America squarely in the driver's seat. The whole agreement is legally binding, and it will be overseen by a peace council.
Chaired by who?
Chaired by U.S. President Trump. Any violations of the peace deal would trigger automatic international sanctions. It cements the U.S., and the president specifically, as the ultimate guarantor.
That is an unprecedented level of oversight. And we also see the U.S. pushing for immediate political change inside Ukraine.
That's point 18. It requires Ukraine to hold elections as soon as possible after the deal is signed. The thinking is you need to stabilize the internal politics to legitimize the government that signs this deal.
All of this really emphasizes the risk Ukraine faces if a deal like this fails. Our analysis points to a pretty chilling alternative.
The Georgia scenario. A slow drift into a geopolitical gray space. When you don't have firm Western security anchors, you get a state of, well, perpetual instability.
And what does that slow drift actually look like? Why is it so destructive?
It's economic suffocation. It means insurance costs and risk premiums for foreign investors go through the roof.
Nobody wants to build a factory in a potential war zone.
Of course not. So economic growth stalls, talent leaves, and eventually that instability lets creeping Russian influence come back in. It's a reminder that just stopping the fighting doesn't bring justice or prosperity.
So let's review the main trade-offs. Ukraine is negotiating for peace, but they have to accept an 800,000 troop cap, conditional Article 5-like guarantees, and a de facto military line in 4 regions.
Ceding functional control, but not legal ownership.
All while seeking $800 billion for recovery, which Washington largely plans to manage and profit from.
And the success of this whole 20-point plan hinges on leverage. The most powerful tool the West has right now isn't a weapon. It's the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets.
And there's a deadline.
A critical one. Europe needs unanimous consent by July 31st to extend the sanctions keeping those funds blocked. If just one EU member state says no, the sanctions end, the money goes back to Russia, and Moscow gets an instant lifeline. All that leverage, gone.
So what stands out to you? Does the urgency of peace justify the political cost of ceding functional control of territory? Does it justify the loss of financial autonomy? We've given you the data, and now you decide what happens next.